Support for this podcast comes from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative, connecting communities with the resources, infrastructure, and networks to ensure a vibrant local free press.
From KVPR in Fresno, this is Central Valley Daily. It's Thursday, August 28th. I'm Jonathan Linden in for Elizabeth Arkalian. The Trump administration has ended grants and contracts as part of the federal government's new funding priorities.
There's tremendous fear in the nonprofit sector on a number of levels. Some of it's funding, some of it is some of the reductions in staff at some of the federal departments.
We hear about the Valley nonprofits and services caught in the middle of this shakeup. But first, these headlines. The Catholic Diocese of Fresno is expressing deep sorrow after a school shooting in Minneapolis on Wednesday. 2 children were killed and 17 others were injured while they celebrated Mass at the Annunciation Catholic Church. In a statement, Fresno Diocese officials asked for prayers for everyone affected. Meanwhile, local officials are reviewing school security protocols here in the Valley to help ensure a safe environment for all Catholic school families. A Northern California assemblyman is asking to split the state. KVPR's Rachel Livenall reports on a new bill introduced by James Gallagher.
Gallagher says this would help rural California feel less left out.
There do become times when people do not get the representation that they need, and they have a way to go get it. And one of those ways is by obtaining statehood.
Gallagher's bill comes as Governor Gavin Newsom signed a bill last week asking voters to change congressional districts. If voters approve Newsom's measure, it would likely help Democrats gain more power in Congress. Gallagher's idea to split the state into 2 would make the state's coastal region its own state, and all of the inland part of the state a separate state. Splitting California into 2 is definitely not a new idea, and it's unclear whether this would succeed. For KVPR News, I'm Rachel Livenall.
A federal judge has temporarily blocked the Trump administration from withholding millions of dollars from the city of Fresno. Officials in Fresno, along with those of several other cities, filed a lawsuit last week against executive orders by the Trump White House. The executive order sought to withhold money from cities over so-called woke language. Officials argue in their lawsuit that the orders are too vague. The judge's temporary order protects more than $100 million for Fresno in the meantime. Officials broke ground on the new Clovis Regional Library on Wednesday. The project has been years in the making and will act as a second library in the city with a much larger, modern space. KVPR's Samantha Rangel reports from the groundbreaking ceremony.
The new Clovis Regional Library will be the largest in the county at more than 26,000 square feet. Sally Gomez is the county's library director. She says the building will provide the much-needed space and services for the city's growing population.
People still understand the value of libraries and what they mean for the community and what they can do. You know, it's not just free entertainment, it's resources, it's education, it's information, it's connections, it's all of that.
The project is funded through a mix of sources. Clovis Mayor Vong Manatua says he's excited for the future.
I'm always excited to see a piece of dirt turn into something the community can use. So as a city, you're always happy when there's investment into your land to make it something where residents can use.
Construction will take at least 18 months. With KVPR News, I'm Samantha Rangel.
Airlines are making it more difficult to track planes as deportation flights reach record numbers. The AP reports ICE air contractors are using dummy call signs for the planes in the air. The news outlet cited independent groups that monitor the flights. They're also hiding tail numbers so planes can't be easily located on public tracking websites. On the ground, planes are also parked behind buildings so migrants can't be seen arriving or boarding. Airlines and contractors have faced public criticism for involvement in ICE deportation flights.
The 2025 edition of KVPR's $10,000 drawing is underway. Do your part and support the station by purchasing a ticket for a chance to win $10,000. Tickets are $100 each and limited to 800 sold. Other prizes include a 2-night stay at the Cottage Inn in Pismo Beach and $250 to dine at restaurants in your community. Tickets are available now at kvpr.org/10K.
And now to our main story. Since taking office in January, President Donald Trump's administration has gone after federal spending. That includes ending grants and contracts that fund a wide array of nonprofits offering social service programs. And the Trump administration has threatened to slash even more funding. So, how are those cuts impacting us here in the Central Valley? According to recent reporting by KVPR Associate Editor Kerry Klein, nearly 400 nonprofits in the San Joaquin Valley received funding from local, state, or federal government agencies in 2023. And more than 60% of those same organizations would be operating in the red if all that funding were to disappear. To give us an idea of how cuts are already affecting services on the ground and what more is at stake, Kerry Klein joins me now in the studio to break this down for us. Hey, Kerry.
Hi, Jonathan.
So first, Kerry, could you just lay out for us what the current status is of government funding for nonprofits?
Right. Well, like in so many sectors, starting when Trump took office, nonprofit organizations have seen a lot of their funding supplies threatened, reduced, or even cut off. This funding typically comes in the form of grants, loans, or contracts for a set amount of funding or a set amount of time. Not all nonprofits do get any of this public funding, but many do. And in some cases, grants that have already been awarded are cut off before awardees get all of their money. And in other cases, contracts that had been expected to be renewed suddenly weren't, starting with this new administration. And this is all a little bit unusual because for decades, the government has been supporting these so-called public-private partnerships. It's this idea that the government can promote social good by supporting these organizations that are doing the work already out in these communities. And the fact that these partnerships are deteriorating and in some cases dissolving is not an accident. A White House spokesperson told the Associated Press earlier this summer that a lot of this funding was wasteful or even corrupt. It's part of this effort to reduce wasteful spending in the federal government. And that instead of pouring so many federal dollars into these groups, the White House instead wants to incentivize individual charitable giving.
And I do know that you were able to get your hands on some data on government funding. What did you learn from that?
Yeah, so it's hard to say on any major scale just how much funding has been pulled away from these organizations so far. So instead, we got our hands on some data about how much government funding organizations receive across the country, so we can at least determine who's vulnerable and how much is on the line. The data comes from the Urban Institute. They're a social policy think tank. They shared their data with the Associated Press and other media outlets. And they got their data from tax forms filed by all nonprofits across the U.S. from the year 2023. And they totaled up all funding that they reported that comes from any government agency. So that could be at the national level, state level, local level. It doesn't discriminate which level that funding comes from. So not all of this funding is necessarily vulnerable to federal policy changes, but at least gets us part of the way there.
Okay, and so nationally, what does government funding look like and how much money is provided, where exactly, and in what sectors?
So every state in the U.S. gets this public funding. It's common throughout the entire country. And in 2023, the total was about $268 billion across the entire country. That's in all sorts of sectors, almost any kind of nonprofit you can imagine. So there's community health, education and literacy, arts and culture, food assistance, refugee resettlement, religious organizations, even some universities and schools. And perhaps not surprisingly, California received the most out of any state.
And I want to talk a little bit about how this is impacting us locally. What does the government funding look like here in the San Joaquin Valley, and how are organizations being impacted?
Yeah, we get a lot of funding here. So if we look at 7 counties from Merced and Mariposa down through Kern, we get about $1.9 billion total from all these public funding sources. Yeah, almost $2 billion.
That's a lot.
It is a lot. Fresno and Kern counties receive by far the most of that. All told, there are about 400 nonprofits receiving government funding in these counties. And of those, more than half, even upwards of more than 2/3 in some of those counties, are at risk of operating in the red without this funding. And so what that means is that if all that public funding were to disappear, these organizations would have a negative operating surplus. They might not be able to operate. Again, we don't know how much of this funding really is at risk, but this is an indicator of just how big a role these public funding sources play in this area. And this is all why Tom Collishaw says many nonprofit leaders are concerned.
There's tremendous fear in the nonprofit sector on a number of levels. Some of it's funding, Some of it is some of the reductions in staff at some of the federal departments has really been done with a hatchet rather than a scalpel. And that has had significant impacts on how programs can operate efficiently.
Kala Shah is the CEO of Self-Help Enterprises, a nonprofit based in Visalia that provides housing assistance and helps with access to clean and affordable drinking water.
And I know you just mentioned Kala Shah, but I know you also spoke to some other local nonprofit leaders as well. When you were speaking to them, what kinds of programs did they say they've already had to cut so far?
Yeah, well, let's look at the Community Action Partnership of Kern, or CAP-K. They're a public service nonprofit based in Bakersfield. All of their funding comes from the federal government. Their CEO, Jeremy Tobias, told me that a reduction to the farm bill earlier this year cut back how much food they could offer through their Bakersfield food bank.
It was about 3.4 million pounds of food that we lost at the food bank. To give you an idea, we distribute, last year in 2024, we distributed 22.5 million pounds of food.
So do the math, that's like a 15% reduction in what's on their shelves this year compared to last year. Tobias said fluctuations in federal funding are normal, especially for their organization, but there are some other cuts on the table in Congress that could have bigger impacts in Kern County, like reducing their utility assistance, food boxes for seniors, and they could even end up laying off a handful of CAP-K employees. There's another organization, CASA, of Fresno and Madera counties. They provide legal and social support for foster youth. They're facing a loss of state funding. It's not federal funding. But because of a state budget deficit, Executive Director Wilma Hashimoto says a contract that had provided $500,000 a year is not being renewed later this year.
That was 25% of our budget. So that's very significant. We hold a very lean budget. We do have fundraisers as well, but everyone is impacted by the economy, right?
She wonders if the situation could have been different if the federal government hadn't reduced its funding to states. And then other news outlets have reported on lots of other organizations that have been affected. So in April, Fresno Land reported on $11 million that were canceled in grants to Fresno County health organizations. Think mobile health vans, outreach to rural communities. And EdSource reported in May that DOGE cut $400 million out of AmeriCorps nationally, which reduced student support and tutoring at some school districts here in the Valley.
And before I let you go, Kerry, do we know what's next for the federal budget? Will we potentially see more cuts that could impact nonprofits here in California and across the country?
The short answer is yes. The budget for the next fiscal year is still up in the air. Congress has until October 1st. Like every year, there's a possibility of a government shutdown if neither party in Congress wants to compromise. There could be a continuing resolution that would maintain federal funding at the current levels, or Congress could negotiate an entirely different budget. Anything is still on the table.
All right, KVPR Associate Editor Kerry Klein, thanks so much for breaking this down for us.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan.
And that's today's show. Do you enjoy listening to Central Valley Daily? Support the podcast by leaving a 5-star rating in your podcast app. We really do appreciate your support. Today's episode was produced by me, Jonathan Linden, Kerry Klein, and KVPR, with support from the Central Valley Journalism Collaborative. You can find the latest local news anytime at kvpr.org. These days, there's so much news, it can be hard to keep up with what it all means for you, your family, and your community. The Consider This podcast from NPR features our award-winning journalism. 6 days a week, we bring you a deep dive on a news story and provide the context and analysis that helps you make sense of the news. We get behind the headlines. We get to the truth. Listen to the Consider This podcast from NPR.